So we've now seen what the argument against common knowledge in the sailboat case is. I want to now consider some objections. The first objection notes the similarity between this argument and the argument we saw against the KK principle. While some of the details are different, I think you'll have got a sense of déjà vu from last time when thinking about this argument. And that might make you wonder about the relationship between them and maybe try to pose an objection on this basis. You might suspect that actually really what's going on here is related to the KK principle, given how similar the arguments are. So why shouldn't we just reject the margin for error principle? And if we reject the margin for error principle, won't that just get us out of the trouble here? So if the arguments are connected, and we want to, and obviously the way to respond to the KK argument is to reject the margin for error principle, why won't that do here as well? However, things are not that simple. It's true that there's a structural similarity between the arguments. We go through this train of reasoning about the heights of the mast, that's sort of like the chain of reasoning we went through about the heights of the tree last time. But it was crucial in the case of KK that it's all happening in one person's head, as it were. And the margin for error principle only talks about one person's knowledge. Or putting it another way, KK only tells you about your own knowledge. KK says that if you know something, then you know it. It doesn't say that if you know something, you know other people know it. But interpersonal ignorance is not about your knowledge of your own mind. It's about knowledge of other people's minds. It says if you know something looks some way to you, then for all you know, it could look slightly different to somebody else. But it's completely consistent with the idea that I know all the contents of my own mind, I know everything about my own knowledge, but I don't know everything about everybody else's knowledge. It's not just consistent, it looks like that would have to be the case. Nobody thinks that we know all the contents of other people's minds, so even people who think that KK holds will have to concede that we don't know the content, even when we know the contents of our own minds, we don't know the contents of others. So denying the margin for error principle is not going to get us out of trouble here. You could assume that KK holds, you could assume that whenever somebody knows something, they know that they know it. So that will get you that when Roman knows the tree looks a particular height to him, he knows that he knows that. But it doesn't tell you that he knows that Columba knows that. Because the crucial feature here is that we're going back and forth between different people. That's what the interpersonal ignorance principle says. It's saying that one person is ignorant of how things are to another. And no amount of stipulating that people know the contents of their own minds is going to be able to rule out this kind of ignorance about other people's minds. Stipulating that you're knowledgeable about your own mind doesn't mean you're completely knowledgeable about other people's minds. A different kind of objection is that you might think that the starting assumption that the tree looks 300 centimeters tall to Roman is implausible. Because you might think, well, isn't it implausible that trees look, or masts look, to be a certain height? And I think that's right. It is true that it's implausible to think that the mast looks to be precisely 300 centimeters tall to Roman. However, this doesn't really help, because once we make some changes, we can just run the argument all over again. So instead of saying that the tree looks 300 centimeters tall to Roman, we could say that it looks roughly 300 centimeters tall to Roman. But once we add the roughly, we need to think about where else we need to add roughly as well. And I think it looks in particular like we should add roughly to our interpersonal ignorance principle. So instead of saying that it's common knowledge that if it looks to be a particular height to someone, for all they know, it could be slightly shorter than that height to the other person. Really what we should say is it's public information that, say, if it looks roughly 300 centimeters tall to Roman, then for all he knows, it looks roughly 299 centimeters or 297 centimeters to Columba. So that's just the exact same principle as before. It's exactly the same as the interpersonal ignorance principle from before, except we've added roughly. So just as we added roughly to our initial premise, we've also added roughly to our argument. But once we've done that, and as seems plausible, if we want to say things only roughly look one way to somebody, then it seems like we should also adjust our other idea to say, well, if it looks roughly one way to me, then it could look roughly a little bit shorter to you. The argument will just go through. I won't go through that in detail yourselves, but you'll be able to see that if you start with the assumption that it looks roughly 300 centimeters tall to Roman, and you adjust the interpersonal ignorance principle in just the way I suggested, you get exactly the same problem as we saw before. The last objection I want to consider questions the scope of the argument. Because as a sort of concessive move, you might say, okay, I'm convinced that they don't have common knowledge of the height of the mast. So maybe they don't commonly know it's greater than 100 centimeters. But you promised me, you might say, a general argument against common knowledge. You said that very little is common knowledge, but you've only focused on this particular case and shown a particular piece of information that is public is not common knowledge. It's worth noticing, I mean, any counterexample is still a counterexample, but it is right that the impact of the argument is less if there are merely some cases where public information isn't common knowledge, because that leaves open the possibility that, well, maybe a lot of the rest of the time public information is common knowledge. However, Lederman thinks that this is actually not the case. He thinks that you can actually generalize the argument to apply to pretty much anything we learn through perception. So let's just take an arbitrary example. Suppose you and I are just standing around, and it might be public information that I'm standing in front of you. So that's something that might be public. So there's some way that things appear to you. You have this perceptual field. My standing there looks a certain way to you. But we can massage this case into the form of the sailboat case by thinking, well, it looks like if we just made like subtle changes to your perceptual field, very small ones, but we did them long enough, we can maybe turn the appearance of me standing in front of you into there being just a big rock in front of you. So maybe you like widen me at certain points gradually, and you make me more grey at points gradually. If you keep doing that in the stages corresponding to the argument we did above, it's reasonable to think you could get a sequence which starts with me as I actually look to you and ends with the perceptual appearance that you would have if you were looking at a rock. So it would be a very long sequence. It would take a lot of changes for that to happen. But it looks like you could eventually, through a sequence of small changes, get through the perceptual appearance of me standing in front of you to the perceptual appearance of a rock being in front of you. As we said, that's very long, but remember, it doesn't matter, because to say that something is commonly known is to say that it's mutually known at all levels. But we know that when you have a sequence of small changes like this, if for all I know, things could look just a little bit different from you, it looks like we could turn that into an argument to say, well, take the number of changes you would actually have to make to get from me to a rock. Wouldn't that be an argument against mutual knowledge to that degree? Because just as we saw that mutual knowledge gives out because of small changes we might make to the heights of the mast, it looks like we can make an analogous argument that mutual knowledge to whatever degree that is that corresponds to the number of small changes you'd need to make to get from me to a rock, wouldn't that level of mutual knowledge give out for just the same reason? Because in here, just as with the case of the heights of the mast, it looks like if something looks a certain way to you, then you can't rule out that it might look a slightly different way to me. So we just took two arbitrary propositions that I'm in front of you, that there's a rock in front of you. It seems plausible we can get from the appearance of one to the appearance of the other by some very, very long sequence of small changes. But once we have that sequence of small changes, it looks like we could apply the argument that we saw in the sailboat case as well. And this isn't exactly a proof, but Lederman's challenge is that basically he thinks that, well, pick any two things you want. Like, pick anything you think is common knowledge on the basis of perception. Couldn't I construct a similar sequence? Maybe we're all in a lecture hall, and it looks to you that we're laid out in the lecture hall in a certain way. Couldn't you find a sequence which leads from the appearance of us all looking to be in the lecture hall to it looking that there's a bunch of rocks in the lecture hall and no people? So again, for any kind of proposition that you know on the basis of perception, you could start with how that proposition appears to you, and on the basis of this kind of small changes argument, arrive at the conclusion that that there's some level of mutual knowledge that this gives out at. Just at some level, you don't have mutual knowledge at that level that we're in the room. If that's right, then his argument does deliver something more like what was promised at the beginning. We started by thinking about a particular sailboat example, but Lederman has tried to motivate the claim that think about any proposition you think you know on the basis of perception, and that might be public. maybe we can construct a sequence which would undermine the idea that it's common knowledge in that case, just as we were able to do in the sailboat case.